Welcome everyone to DRJ's webinar series. I'm Bob Arnold, President here at DRJ. We thank you for your attendance today and we hope you gather some great information from today's webinar. Everyone's phone has been muted and we ask you to utilize the question panel you'll find on the right-hand side of your screen. Our speakers today will attempt to answer as many of these as possible at the end of today's session. Also, a PDF of today's presentation is also available on the Handout tab, again located on the right-hand side of your screen, so you can take your time anytime during the webinar and download that PDF slide, follow along. So today's sponsor is MetricStream. Today's topic is Convergence of Cybersecurity and BCM, Cyber Attack Planning and Response. Our speakers today are French Caldwell and Ahmad Moline. French Caldwell serves as Chief Evangelist of MetricStream. He served as Research Vice President of Gartner's Research Division as well. Mr. Caldwell covers regulatory compliance and high-performance workplace sectors and led governance, risk, and compliance research. Mr. Caldwell writes and presents on knowledge management. His research includes analysis of the impact of regulatory developments on IT, compliance technologies, corporate governance, and many more. Ahmad Moline is the Chief Technology Officer for Everbridge. In this role, Ahmad is responsible for Everbridge's market strategy, product roadmap, innovation, and research and development. Ahmad is a regular presenter at industry events and is frequently quoted in leading publications on various topics including cloud computing, software as a service, critical communications, and many more. With no further introductions, I'd like to turn the mic over to French.
Thanks a lot, Bob. I appreciate the introduction. Certainly, in my 15 years at Gartner, I covered a lot of topics, and I was, as a Gartner Fellow, one of the topics that really caught my interest that I worked on both at Gartner and here at MetricStream is around disruptive technologies, the changing business models that certainly make people more susceptible to disruption from cybersecurity attacks. So I think one of the biggest challenges that we're facing is certainly around this convergence of cybersecurity and business models, which now means that BCM becomes a very significant element of an overall cybersecurity program, enabling resilience of companies that are becoming more and more dependent on digital business models. Every company has some form of digital business model these days, whether it's simply adopting mobile platforms for keeping your employees in touch with the company, or whether it is actually delivering mobile capabilities to your customers, or perhaps you're an electrical utility in which you're embedding all types of digital technology into new services and capabilities that you're delivering to consumers. So this is a changing world, and that's what makes this a much more salient topic than it may have been just a few years ago, when a lot of these developments were still theoretical. But today they're quite real. So let's go ahead and take a look here at what the transition has been over time. I think a lot of organizations are still stuck in this idea that in the age of the firm, where the firm was located in a central location, there may be branches or outlets or other elements of the firm in different places, but you could see the physical infrastructure that made up the firm. As we began to take a look at making changes to how companies operated, and they became more dependent on logistics and began to connect more to suppliers that were not part of their vertical, structure, then we began to move into this age of distribution, an age of logistics. Computer technology was coming along at the same time. If you go back and look at some of the literature around information technology in the late 60s, early 70s, and into the 80s, you see where there's a lot of discussion around disintermediation, where buyers and sellers are connecting to each other and removing the intermediaries with their warehouses and warehouses of components and spare parts and raw materials. In the 1990s, we began to make this even more efficient, and we moved into the age of information, where the information technology itself began to be so significant that an outage of the information technology itself would create significant disruptions to the functioning of our companies, our organizations. And we still live in that day to day. We live in that environment today. By the way, you know, the age of logistics is still here with us. The age of information is still with us. But we've now moved into an era where information technology has moved from being business-centric to person-centric. And our business models are adapting and changing to this new person-centric, you know, digital business model. You know, our smartphones are only part of that. We're starting to see businesses that are built around this person-centric model. Certainly Facebook and Google and social media were early bellwethers of that change. But today we're starting to see businesses like Uber and Airbnb and so on that are emblematic of the age of the person-centric business models. Very distributed models in which the consumer is actually a producer as well. We've heard people talking about the gig economy. And we have extraordinarily distributed enterprises where we're dependent upon third parties, and these third parties now have been fractured right down to the individual. So with large distributed enterprises, dependencies upon all kinds of other companies, and now what's emerging is dependencies around individuals themselves. Our companies have a lot to protect when it comes to cybersecurity and business continuity. We are, by the way, I think that cyber breaches are kind of a stage behind where the business models are. So if you look at most of the cyber attacks these days, the ones that are certainly making the news, these are attacks against you know, sort of traditional data sources with where there's lots and lots of personal information, credit card information, health information. These are economically motivated attacks to the most part, although we're starting to see the emergence of state-sponsored cyber attacks to steal intellectual property as well. But right now, the idea of cyber attacks against more of this new person-centric business models and the disruption that will cause companies, it's still a little bit lagging. Although, if you take a look at the Stuxnet virus, there's an example of a major cyber attack that was meant to not steal information, but actually shut down critical infrastructure. Right? That becomes a huge business continuity challenge. If you look at the retaliation from Stuxnet against Saudi Aramco and against Rasgas and Qatar, these were attacks that were meant to actually cause tremendous disruption and shut down critical infrastructure. They didn't succeed in that regard. At that point, they were actually halted before they could do significant damage to the critical infrastructure of those companies. But guess what? They did stop those companies' production. They stopped those companies from operating without actually getting into the critical, breaking through the critical infrastructure. As they pulled the plug, they began to figure out how far the attackers had actually gotten. So there was a significant business continuity problem there that resulted from a cybersecurity threat. And we expect to see more and more and more of this over time. I mentioned these new digital business models that are emerging, and Uber and Airbnb and their competitors are in the news practically every day, as there's all kinds of regulatory concerns and disruption of business models of legacy companies. But on the other hand, a lot of those legacy companies are starting to adopt the digital business models that were introduced by these disruptors. But where are we going here in the future? Most of us probably are not going to be significantly disrupted if Uber were to find that it couldn't deliver its services for a few hours or a day or whatever, or if Airbnb, it really wouldn't cause all that major of a disruption except to those companies. So as your company becomes more and more dependent on these digital business models, this is something to think about. Certainly, if you operate critical infrastructure, you need to think about disruption. We see the emergence of new cybersecurity laws to deal with ensuring the continuity of operations of critical infrastructure and the resilience against cyber attacks. It's going to get worse. I'd say the threat is going to get worse. Hopefully, the results don't. But the threat is going to get worse, not because just of the attackers, but because of the targets that we're creating for them to attack. The city of Helsinki is moving towards a fully automated personal transportation system, which they plan to have fully automated by 2025. What does this mean? Well, it means that you'll be able to pull out your smartphone app, and call up an app that says, I am here and I need to get there. Right now you can do that and you pull it up and Google Maps will tell you, all right, walk 3 blocks, wait at the bus station, wait at the bus stop, change buses here, change buses there, and you'll finally get to where you want to go. Or you can call up Uber and they'll pick you up wherever you are and take you to wherever you want to go. That costs a lot more. Helsinki's saying, hey, why don't we just change the bus route to go pick you up where you are? You don't need to walk 3 blocks. Or we'll tell you where the nearest cycle rack is, where you can take that cycle to, meet the bus. Bus will pick you up, drop you off, and then a fully automated driverless car will pick you up, take you through into the central city, and drop you off right where you need to be. Fully automated personal transportation network. When we get to that point where nobody really is driving a car, it's all fully automated, imagine the vulnerabilities that you have for disruption. You could shut down a whole city for hours or days or whatever. All right. Medical implants. There's a lot of people who are concerned about the growing vulnerabilities there. Do you know there are 100,000 cyborgs in the world now? 100,000 people with some type of implant that affects their brain. Imagine the business continuity issues if your employees are shut down. All right? Already in warehouses, employees are taking orders from robots. That is happening today. Imagine if the robots cannot operate and the employees just stop. They wear devices that tell them where to go, what to take off of what shelf, what to put in what box, where to take something and put it on. The humans are working for the robots. So we've got all kinds of new business continuity challenges that are emerging. They're all cyber related. Cyber breaches continue to occur. Fortunately, like I said, most of these cyber breaches are a generation behind where the actual business models are emerging today. So they're a generation behind these new digital business models. They're attacking the old stuff. Getting credit card information, driver license information, collecting, all of this old stuff. We got to be able to protect that. If we can't protect that, we are going to be in for a real surprise when the actual functioning of all of our companies depends totally upon cyber infrastructure that's vulnerable to attack. There's a reputational issue as well. So this mobile phone provider, TalkTalk, in the UK, where there was a major attack just the other day, a week ago. I think they arrested a teenager in Northern Ireland yesterday. But their stock dropped 10%. It's mostly due to reputational issues. It didn't stop the service. People are still able to talk. But we have to think about the impact on reputation, not just the impact on continuity of operations. Sony attack is probably the most cited major attack, where it actually you really had several different things happening here. You had certainly the loss of personal information. You had the embarrassment of reputation, since severe reputational damage is not just the reputation from, oh, look how vulnerable they are. It was also reputations like, look what their executives are saying about the president. These are things that are hard to recover from. Are they business continuity issues? To some extent. Is it a business continuity issue when the next release of a major movie you spent $75 million on has to be given away for free because it's already for free out there all over the internet? Sony has also had other attacks where services are shut down. There was the PlayStation attack a couple of years ago. Cost several $1 million to recover from, and they essentially shut down the online PlayStation service for a month while they figured out how to recover from it. The economic costs are tremendous, the reputational costs, and then, of course, the inability to deliver services to your customers is a severe drain on the company as well. There are new rules and regulations that are being developed. They're mostly, like I said, still dealing with the legacy issues, the theft of intellectual property, the ability to deter threats against traditional assets like data sources of customer information, employee information, health records. The CISA vote in the Senate yesterday, where the Senate passed the new Information Sharing Act, is a movement towards improving our ability to understand the threats and be able to respond to them and share information around them. I expect to see more laws there, but also keep in mind these laws will create new conflicts. If you're a company that operates in Europe and in the U.S., what information can you share with the government in the U.S.? The U.K. has its own version of CISA. Every country is going to have its own version. The UK version has been in operation for 2 years now, by the way. So you end up with all kinds of new risk, compliance risk, and so on, and we have to keep track of all of this and make sure that we're up to date and that our business continuity programs account for all of the new rules and regulations that are going to be emerging. Now, I think I've made the case here that continuity is sort of a central factor in your planning, planning for actually responding to cyber attacks. That there is a clear overlap, and that this overlap is going to be bigger and bigger and bigger over time as our business models change. That means that we're going to have to plan across organizational silos, work with the business continuity organization has to work with both the strategic, it has to work with strategic planning, they have to work with IT security, and work with the enterprise architects. It's no longer just a matter of sitting back and doing our planning, testing our plans, and so on. We have to actually take a look at each of our new digital business models that we are going to be developing and get involved in the strategic planning phase of that to ensure effective continuity of operations on an ongoing basis. So the more digital our firms become, the more that BCM becomes an important part of overall strategic planning, and the integration with cybersecurity and enterprise architecture increases. you know, going back, just taking, this doesn't mean that really, you know, the critical competencies of BCM change significantly. It means that it becomes more prevalent and a more important part and a more visible part of the organization. It means that we're going to have to test our plans on a much more frequent basis if they're affecting any of the new business models around operational technology, new Internet of Things-based business models, or new sort of app-based business models that our companies are engaging with. But the overall critical competencies overall do not change. They just become more valuable to the organization as a whole. We'll still need response plans, response strategies. They're going to have to operate even more quickly. We need to focus on how can we identify and contain breaches, and not just breaches, but identify and contain and monitor on an ongoing basis, not wait for the breach, but be ahead of time. Crisis and incident management when services, life-threatening services or life threats to life are actually, you know, when we actually have threats to life and limb, crisis and incident management become even more important. So think about this, you know, when you actually have the potential now for people hacking into medical devices or hacking into transportation networks, cybersecurity and business continuity are not just protecting the company now, you're actually protecting the lives of individuals. Cybersecurity has become a life and safety discipline. Now, MetricStream has partnered with Everbridge. We're a company that's been involved in the governance, risk, and compliance space for over 10 years now. We have a number of different solutions. Business continuity is one of them. We also have IT GRC solutions that focus on cybersecurity. We have partnered now with Everbridge to have a full end-to-end solution for cybersecurity, BCM, and emergency notification. And I'm glad to be able to, at this point, share the microphone with my colleague here from Everbridge, who will take you through what actually happens if something bad does happen. You know, so all of the risk management that we do in cybersecurity, you know, what happens next? When risk management fails, now you're in crisis management. And you've got to let everybody know and bring your whole team together to respond. So, Ahmad, glad to have you join us here as well.
Thank you very much, French. Thank you for the overall insights into not just what is, but what is likely going to be out there. And I will actually pick up on a couple of the cases that you actually cited. But ultimately, I'm just going to talk about incidents and crises and a tale of two or more organizations that are going to be blended together, and then go into planning and best practices around communications. Basically, what are the few things that you need to think about? Some of them might be very basic, but you'd be surprised as to how dealing with some very, very basic items that go back, in some cases, to business continuity planning 101 can make all the difference in the world. And then we'll go back with some takeaways. So, you know, let me ask you to put yourselves in somebody else's shoes. Let's play a little game of what if. French mentioned several organizations that have been in the news lately because they've been the subject of breaches or cyber attacks. But in many cases, I certainly like to put myself in the shoes of the people who are responsible for either the business continuity or security or whatever departments happen to be under duress during some of these incidents. And I like to say, what would I do? So what if it was you? What if your domain controllers, for example, were taken over by somebody else who just stayed within your system for a long time, so long that you could no longer distinguish between friend and foe in your system? if you could no longer trust your email, if you could no longer trust your intranet, if you found out that all of your emails, even a year later, were published to a well-known leaks website? What if all of your point-of-sales terminal were taken over nationwide across stores, causing an untold amount of damage, both real, financial, and reputational? Now, of course, I'm not talking about a single company here, but multiple. But again, what would you do if you were in the middle of a crisis like this? What if the crisis is so big, ultimately, that you can even suggest that it was responsible for making frosty relations between two nations even frostier? Now, this might be a little bit of hyperbole, but I think you get the sense for where things might go. Sometimes it's just one more incident, one last one, that might cause a certain escalation that certainly very few of us would like to see happen. So I go back to, what would you do if this were to happen to you today, or even worse, if this were to happen on a Sunday morning at 2 a.m.? So I'll go back to, first and foremost, regain control. In order to regain control, one must certainly be prepared to communicate. One must regain control of communications. In the case that French mentioned earlier of Sony Pictures, one thing that they ended up doing that helped them start the recovery process is regain control of their communications. Certainly by ensuring that at the very least they could use a completely separate, redundant, secure communication system. And their only regret, as you can see here in this quote that was mentioned over the AP and ABC News from the CEO, is that they didn't have everybody that was already signed up and ready to go onto the Everbridge mass notification system. And ultimately, they needed to sign the rest of the people. But that's what helped them regain control and no longer worry about, if I were to send this email, is it going to get to the good guy or the bad guy? In this case, they knew that only the good guys were being part of the recovery effort. So I go back to something that's very, very basic. Have a plan. Have a plan that covers maybe not all the scenarios, because especially given all of these new disruptive business models and technologies, you may not necessarily have thought of every single little thing that could go wrong. But cover the basics. You know, when do minor things like service requests or minor incidents become major incidents? What about the items that you should be able to deal with on a daily basis? You know, think of them as routine emergencies. What is it that you have planned for them so they don't become crises or crisis emergencies? What type of plans do you have in place that go from business continuity to crisis management to disaster recovery? How are you dealing with a variety of different incidents that might be either contained or widespread? Do you have them classified the appropriate way? Do you have the right classification around impact or urgency so you know what to do at that point? So it all starts with having the right plan for the right types of situations. Now, a plan without an underlying communication plan is simply not a plan. And part of what I would urge you to do is think about communicating across multiple stages of a particular incident or a crisis, if that's what we're at. I'm not advocating for any particular framework. You may be using a 4-stage framework as part of an incident response plan. You may be leveraging a 6-stage framework. But ultimately, part of what you must think about is, what is it that you're going to say and to whom across every single stage, not just when the crisis happens or when the incident occurs. You have to realize that while the active threat timelines can be quick, what's key is the response after the fact, because that might be what has the largest impact on the outcome, whether it's reputational or otherwise. Depending on how you respond to an incident is what might make it better or worse. In some cases, the cover-up is worse than the crime. In this case, how you respond to an incident or crisis might have more impact than the incident itself. And clear communication can make a difference between life and death, routine, and crisis. And the key here is to have a plan ahead of time that covers every single stage. What are you going to say if you have nothing to say, if there is no update? Well, guess what? Depending on who the stakeholders are, you may still want to have a communication that goes out and to let people know when that next update is going to be. Radio silence is not an option because they don't know whether you're not communicating with them because you can't, you don't know what's going on, or simply that there's no update and you're working on it. Do you have a plan for what happens when you actually resolve the issue? What are you going to say and to whom and how? It's key that as part of your plan that you've thought through all of these stages ahead of time for every single type of incident that you have an ultimate business continuity plan for. 3, that plan needs to include communication with all stakeholders. It's not just the people who are going to fix the issue, for example, or just your executive team, or just your critical incident response team. Think of it ahead of time as to all the stakeholders, both internal and external, who need to know what's going on, whether it's for simple informational reasons or because they have an active role to play. This is an example, a very real example, of an organization that was the subject of a pretty devastating cyber attack that led to a data breach. And this is a representative timeline. So whether the cyber attack was detected manually or automatically, ultimately it was detected. But at what point in time do you make a decision to activate a critical incident response team? At what point in time, and who has the guts at 2 a.m. to say, I am going to pick up the phone and wake the CEO up at home by calling his or her landline? Do you have a plan that allows you to do that at 2 a.m. on a Sunday? Do you know when it is just a routine issue that IT security can handle versus a potentially existential issue for an organization that needs to be dealt with immediately regardless of time of day or day of week? Do you have the right plan to bring in legal? And yes, marketing and customer service, and how are you going to handle those external players? What are you going to say and to whom? Are you going to let consumers potentially flood your phone lines, asking questions on social media, telling you and saying things that you don't want to hear? Again, if your plan today does not include not just communicating across all stages, but the actual communication for all relevant stakeholders, then you don't have a plan. Now, here's when we need to start looking at reality out there. Plan for things to break. You can't plan for the best possible scenario. So, for example, plan for communications to break down. We saw that in the Sony example, and we can see that in a variety of other examples out there where communications are simply break down. Whether it's the inability to send out emails because your email has been compromised, or the fact that phone lines are simply unavailable because of a natural disaster, or because it's such a big and widespread issue that you're having issues with central offices that are leading to ultimately your PBXs. No single delivery path is ever going to be 100% reliable 100% of the time. And no single delivery path is going to be available or reliable 100% of the time in everywhere across the board. So if you have a global team, if you have a distributed team, and as French had mentioned before, we're no longer in the age where everybody is going to be located in 1 or 2 major locations. The only way to ensure that you're going to increase the chances of being able to get to people and have people get back to you is multimodal messaging. Have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different ways of reaching out to people. It's a plan B and C and D, because things will break. And the more distributed your team is, the more countries are involved, the more this is required. Have a plan to communicate at scale. It's no longer a matter of somebody picking up the phone and activating a call straight. Who are you targeting for what type of message and when? And how are you going to do it? You know, the 10 people who are part of your IT security team, yeah, maybe that's easy enough. But what about your 1,000 employees, your tens of thousands of partners and affiliates, your hundreds of thousands of consumers, if that's the business that you're in? How are you going to activate these type of communication plans so that the right communication goes out to the right person at the right time using the right method, and that you get and can manage all the responses coming back? And in some cases, you have these timelines that literally require responses within seconds, because every second counts. Now, obviously, you're not going to be able to do all of this manually. This is where automation comes in. Regardless of what kind of critical system you're dealing with or what kind of event that you're dealing with, what's key is that you have the ability to take in the appropriate event. And as part of your existing workflows, that you're able to automate the appropriate communication. Based on a particular event, you may want to have the system automatically launch a conference bridge and chase down the appropriate experts or people who are going to fix the issue. And if they can't do it, then the system escalates to the appropriate people. You need to make sure that in parallel, that whether it's at the beginning of that cycle or in the middle or at the end, that the right people from management are notified and they know what's going on. And that all of the stakeholders are notified. In some cases, again, some of these people might have an active role that requires frequent interactions. And in other cases, they're simply notified so they know if there is a role to play, ultimately. But all of this can be automated based on having the appropriate plan that describes the appropriate event. If you have the appropriate classifications ahead of time, if you have the appropriate plan, then you can create some very simple rules that say, depending on the priority, depending on the severity, depending on the impact, depending on the nature, all I need is a brief description of each one of the parameters that describe this event or this incident. And I can create the appropriate set of rules that ultimately dictates who needs to be reached, for what purpose, and how. It will dictate how aggressive my escalation policies might need to be if I don't get to the first tier of recipients quickly enough. It will dictate as to whether that CEO that we discussed before should be called at home and woken up, even if it is 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning. And you don't have to have the person who is on duty in your security operations center or your network operations center having to make that decision and fearing for his or her job. Let the system make that decision based on a thoughtful plan that was created ahead of time. The time to respond is key. It's critical. You don't want to have to overthink it in the middle of a crisis. So those are some of the basics. Now, I'll offer you a path or a solution. This is where the Everbridge platform and the integration with MessageStream comes in. Think of it as a software as a service solution that can handle all of the critical communications, whether you're dealing with emergency notification, physical or cybersecurity response. It'll handle keeping information about all of the different contact information for your stakeholders. And it'll be able to either manually or automatically execute the communication portion of your plans by reaching out to the appropriate people and keeping track of every attempt going out to every person, by automatically invoking the appropriate escalation procedures if need be. And again, whether you're dealing with internal teams or with your customers, or you're dealing with a life and safety type of a situation that may not happen very frequently, or a distributed denial of service attack that may or may not be critical in nature, but that still requires a plan to be activated. So I'll go back to some very, very simple takeaways. I have 7 points. I'm going to take it down to 3. Have a plan. I cannot say this enough. Have a plan, and that plan needs to be complete enough, meaning that it needs to have a communication plan behind it that looks at every stage in your incident or crisis, and it covers all of your stakeholders. If you take a step back, you may determine that your stakeholders, that the people who are going to be affected in some way, shape, or form, are much broader in nature than what you have today. So have a plan that communicates with all of the stakeholders, internal or external partners, anybody who needs to know in some way, shape, or form, whether it's because they have an active role as part of resolving or dealing with the aftermath, or just because they need to know what's going on, including consumers or customers, internal or external. And then think about automating these communication plans. And if at all possible, put them as part of your existing workflows so you don't have to introduce yet another process, yet another tool. From within your existing tools, your existing workflows, you can have a system such as Everbridge automatically kick in and then launch the appropriate communication plans, be they simple or amazingly complex with multiple escalation layers and multi-threaded escalations that are going out to various groups behind the scenes with multiple interactions across the board that mix and match conference bridges and two-way notifications and personalized notifications for people who happen to sit around the world. So automation is absolutely key, but can only happen once you start thinking about what that plan needs to be. So have a plan. Make sure it covers all stakeholders through all stages for most of the scenarios, since you probably won't be able to do all of them. And then think about automating it as part of existing workflows. So at this point in time, we'd like to turn it back over to Bob to handle the questions and answers. And again, please submit any of your questions through the GoToWebinar control panel in writing. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, guys. Again, like Ahmad mentioned, you can find that question panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We do have a few here submitted already. First question, what role does BCM play in strategic planning?
Well, you know, as I think Ahmad just pointed out, you have to have a plan. And these days, as you know, these plans start out from you know, basically very day-to-day business operations focus, but they also, as we move into more and more sort of digital business models and digital business initiatives, where information technology is actually implanted in the things that make our companies work and provide the services to us as individuals, we really need to think about, well, what are the actual, what is the company's strategy related to digital business, and take a look at the cybersecurity risk associated with that, and then include the business continuity planning that is required as part of the overall strategic planning exercise. You know, any company really only has one or two major strategic initiatives going on at any given time. Sometimes you're actually betting the company on some of these. So if you are not including business continuity in that, then this is not a well-placed bet. You're not hedging your bet, being able to ensure the continuity of operations associated with these new strategic business initiatives that you're executing against over a period of a couple of years. So you do need to step, you know, the more and more that these strategic business initiatives are dependent on information technology, the more important it is to ensure that business continuity planning is part of the strategic planning in the strategic planning process.
All right, next question. Is your CIR team on slide 25 different than your crisis management team? Are data incidents funneled through your CMT or a separate team?
The CRIT team and the crisis management team. So if you're looking at you know, overall sort of instant response versus crisis management team, it could vary depending on the type of incident and the size and extent of that incident. You know, so I would say that there are quite often instant response issues where you're not necessarily pulling in the full crisis management team, but if you have a large enough scale of an incident, definitely you're going to be pulling in the crisis management team. They are not necessarily the same, although some of the individuals will certainly overlap between the two. And keep in mind that crisis management teams can also vary in membership depending on the type of crisis. So I would say as a minimum there's going to be some overlap, continuity between the instant response team and the crisis management team, but they're not necessarily the same, and the larger and the greater the extent of the crisis, the less, you know, the more the crisis management team is going to include people that were not on the instant response team.
All right, what is the relationship of BCM and third-party management?
Well, I think as we look at the new, we're dependent on third parties for just about everything that we do these days. We have an extended supply chain. We're dependent on more and more cloud services. And so I think that you've got to take a look at the business continuity planning and the emergency notification capabilities of your third parties as well. The more dependent you are on those third parties, the more disruptive they can be. You need to provide greater scrutiny around them. So I think, Ahmad, you had some more to add on that.
Yeah, so this is why you know, I insisted a little bit on ensuring that you know who all of your stakeholders are. Because again, we're not necessarily just dealing with your employees or your customers, be they internal or external. What are all of the third parties that you are actually going to depend on and who depend on you in some way, shape, or form? And ultimately, do you have a plan that includes them, that includes both being able to continue operating without them or with them being in a degraded mode, but also being able to reestablish the continuity of operations based on their own status or state. So who are your suppliers? What type of dependency do you have on them? Do you have a redundant approach to that particular service or product? And again, that happens on whether you're dealing with the physical goods, a supply chain, or certainly in IT across the board. If you're relying on a downstream provider or a cloud provider or any type of critical service that you're incorporating as part of an application you're offering, are you dealing with just one such supplier? If they happen to have an issue, are you going to be potentially out of business for a certain amount of time? But in any way, shape, or form, based on understanding who those third parties that you have dependencies on and that have dependencies on you, as soon as you know who those are, you need to include them as part of your overall plan, and ensuring that you can communicate with them and they can communicate back with you, that they can let you know as quickly as possible or as soon as possible if there's a change in their overall status or state, so you can take the appropriate action. The better off you'll be.
All right, next question here. During an incident, how often would you send out communications to stakeholders? We don't want to send messages with no updates, but on the other hand, don't want to be accused of lack of communications or communicating.
Right. So it certainly depends on the type of incident that you're dealing with, right? In some cases, we are expecting a frequent update. If I'm sitting here and there's nothing I can do, and all of a sudden I'm in an area where there's an overall lockdown because all the electronic locks are locked, right? I would like probably a slightly more frequent update versus one that tells me that, corporate email is down. So obviously you're not going to send me an email to tell me that the email is down. You want that different redundant methods. You might send me a text or a voice call, but in that case, you might want to do it simply once an hour or so. But what's key here is setting expectations. If you're sending out an update, depending on, again, the severity and the impact of a particular issue, when you send us an update, even if you don't have much to say, you can say the next update will come in an hour. The next update will come in 2 hours. And that should be part of that overall plan, right? How often, based on the severity, based on the impact, how often should we send out updates? And then you have to stick to that. If you have nothing new to say, you simply are going to tell them, look, guess what? The next update is an hour, right? The NOC or the SOC is still working on this issue with our overall providers. The next update will happen, in an hour from now or 2 hours from now. And part of the idea is set that frequency of updates as part of the initial plan as you're classifying these types of incidents and assigning them the severity and the impact.
All right, wonderful. There's several more questions here that have been submitted. I think many of them are a little more technical than we want to probably jump into today, or a little more product oriented. So they'll probably be best handled offline. We'll supply these questions over to our presenters today to follow up with you after the webinar has ended. Any parting words here today, French or Ahmad?
Well, I'd like to come right back to this idea of have a plan. And, I was sort of thinking back on that first question of the strategic planning as well. I know of one story I'll share with you. There was a Canadian bank that acquired a bank in Mexico. And when you're doing mergers and acquisitions, that's a major strategic initiative. The business continuity team was not involved during the due diligence process. And within a week of the acquisition being closed, the Mexican bank had a major business continuity failure, systems loss that prevented them from allowing customers to make withdrawals at their ATMs. It went on for a period of 6 weeks. And the loss of economic value from that was actually delayed the time to value of the merger by a year. So you can see why having business continuity the business continuity management involved with strategic planning could have been a very good move on the part of this bank. So having a plan, getting involved in not just the traditional business continuity planning, but getting involved in strategic planning in the company, as you know, particularly when you're dependent on IT and IT services for those strategic plans. That's extraordinarily important. It's going to be more important as we move into the future these days. Right?
I'll echo the same starting point. Have a plan. It's absolutely key. And as organizations are getting more diverse, as people are getting more mobile, as you're dealing with different demographics and generations, make sure that when you have a plan that you're including everybody, that you are able to communicate with everybody. Whether you happen to have a team in India that is going to be subject to the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, and therefore you have to communicate with them in a certain way, or whether you're dealing with a team in Canada, whether you're dealing with millennials or you're dealing with Generation Xers. The communication piece is key across the board, because your plan is simply not going to work without the underlying communication capabilities. Make sure that you're getting all the right stakeholders and that you're getting them at every single stage across the board.
All right, wonderful, guys. Thanks again, everyone, for their attendance here today. We again hope you gather some great information from today's webinar. DRJ would also like to thank French and Ahmad for presenting for us here today, as well as Metric String for sponsoring today's webinar. We will be emailing everyone a link to the recording of the webinar. You may view it as frequently as you wish or share it with your peers. If you do have any additional questions, please contact Disaster Recovery Journal, or you can see the contact information for our presenters here today. Thanks again for joining us here today, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and everyone have a wonderful day. Take care.